This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 611 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The World Fantasy Basketball Championship is scheduled to take place on March 13th, which means there's still plenty of time for you to qualify for the live final. To get in on the action, enter your best 9-man NBA lineup into a WFBBC qualifier and finish in first place. Each finalist VIP package includes a trip for two to New Orleans, 2 luxury box game tickets to the Hornets-Pelicans game on March 11th, VIP entry to a special fan event, and so much more. The live final will be here before you know it, so head to FanDuel.com/WFBBC today and compete for your chance to party by the bayou. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. It's a mailbag show today. Let's get to it. The first question this week is from @Cooper_DFF, and all it says is, when draft Gabe Davis? So this has been a hot topic on fantasy football Twitter all week long. How should we be valuing Gabriel Davis? I think it's a little bit too early for redraft talk, so I'll just stick with Dynasty with this answer. And this answer is going to be a long-winded one because I want you guys to hear how I incorporate my model with this kind of thing. And it's a model that I want to rely on more this offseason. Talking through a player's journey is how I go about evaluating these things. With Davis, he entered the league as a non-stud prospect. He got picked 128th overall. My model had him as a 60th percentile wide receiver exiting that draft, despite the fact that his breakout age was fine, his size was fine, and he was an early declare. I'm actually a little bit surprised the model didn't like him more than that. But regardless, his hit rate as a 60th percentile wide receiver prospect, not great. In fact, I can tell you how not great it is. My prospect model is focused on how a player performs across his first 3 years in the league. The data point that it's focused on is the average points per game of a player's top 2 seasons across his first 3 years in the NFL. So if a player scored 10, 11, and 12 PPR points per game across his first 3 years, then the model is only concerned about the 11 and 12 number. Throw away that 10. So it's looking at 11.5 because the average of 11 and 12 is 11.5. It uses historical data to help predict what's going to happen during a player's 2-year maximum. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I've bucketed players by percentile to give you a little historical probability chart. I haven't published this chart, but just pretend that it exists because it does. From 2011 through 2019, there have been 21 wide receivers in my database who ranked in the 60th to 65th percentile. Of those 21, only one of them had a 2-year average above 10 PPR points per game. And again, I'm going to publish these charts eventually. That one player was Terry McLaurin, a guy that my model did not like a whole lot. The year 2 model liked him, but not the prospect model. His college production profile was just not good. But I've talked a lot about McLaurin over the last couple of years and why the model didn't like him that much. And that's irrelevant here. What is relevant here is one player out of 21. That's not a good hit rate. But to make this even more consumable and easier to understand, even though this isn't what the model is looking at, I also like looking at best season PPR points per game across a player's first 3 seasons. So the maximum points per game season that a player has over his first 3 years in the league. So again, we have a sample of 21 within this percentile grouping. Of those 21, only 3 of them were able to hit one season with a points per game average above 10. And only one was able to hit a points per game average above 12, which again was Terry McLaurin. So strictly looking at the prospect model, things are not looking great for Gabriel Davis. But let's take this a step further. If you look at the year 2 model, Davis's percentile rank jumps to almost the 80th percentile. He's at 79.6%. And for those of you who didn't listen to last week's mailbag episode, the year 2 model looks at how a player performed in year 1, and then it incorporates that into his prospect score to try to predict how he's going to do in years 2 and 3. So Davis ends up taking a huge jump after year 1. And that's something that we don't see that often from a prospect like him. In fact, since 2011, Davis's year 1 to year 2 jump among players ranked in the 50th percentile or better is 5th highest in my database. Only Martavis Bryant, Terry McLaurin, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I'll talk about in a second, and Denarius Moore saw a bigger year 1 to year 2 jump in percentile ranking. And some of the players right after Gabriel Davis in that top 10 includes Darnell Mooney and T.Y. Hilton. Now, the cool part is that I can run through the exact same exercise with the year 2 model as I did the prospect model. Remember, the year 2 model looks at the best season across a player's second and third year in the league. And also remember, Davis was a 79th, 80th percentile wide receiver in that model, after being a 60th percentile one in the prospect model. And if you look at how a player like that is done historically, it's really not that bad. Now, part of the problem is that Davis is right on the fringe of where I bucket these players. Because technically he's in the 75th to 80th percentile, but he's so close to that 80th percentile mark. So I'll let you know what happens to players in the 80th to 85th percentile, as well as the 75th to 80th. In the 75th to 80th percentile grouping, and again, this is for the year 2 model, 18% of wide receivers in that group had one season of 14 or more PPR points in either year 2 or year 3. When you look at the percentile group ahead of that, or the 80th to 85th percentile group, that number jumps to 30%. And in that same 80th to 85th percentile group, 1/4 of the players hit 16 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. For reference, a 16 plus point per game season is a fringe wide receiver 1 season, or a low end wide receiver 1, high end wide receiver 2. What that means is that if you combine those 2 percentile buckets, you'd probably expect Davis to have maybe a 10 to 15% chance to give you a low end wide receiver 1 or high end wide receiver 2 season in year 2 or 3. Clearly that did not happen in year 2. And the odds are obviously stacked against him. But the odds are stacked against most players that you would also be getting for Gabriel Davis. So yes, he'd have to be somewhat of an outlier with my prospect model for him to hit. There's no doubt. But I think that you could argue that he's already trending to be an outlier because of his jump from year 1 to year 2. And then look at what's going in his favor. He did what he did down the stretch for the Bills when they finally gave him more looks. He did what he did against Kansas City. He's tied to an elite quarterback, and it's logical to think that he's going to enter the 2022 season as a starter. Even though the original chance of him being a great fantasy football wide receiver was not very high based on my model, we have to adjust our initial thoughts on players with new information. And every piece of information that we're getting with Gabriel Davis is that he's probably pretty good. I actually have him at wide receiver 34 in my dynasty rankings right now. That may be higher than what the consensus is saying. I don't know. We don't really know what consensus is thinking right now because all of this is really fresh. But I'm willing to trade players who have established ceilings or maybe on the wrong side of the age curve for Gabriel Davis right now. Because his journey has revealed that he's a pretty good player. And if he doesn't pan out, it's not the end of the world. In a lot of cases, you're not having to spend a fortune to get Gabe Davis. I mean, in some cases you are, don't get me wrong. Some people are definitely overspending. But my overall point is that just because he wasn't highly sought after coming out of school doesn't mean we should simply hold on to those priors with this new information that's come our way. This next question is from @walk_of_Shane, and it says, how early is too early to draft Amon-Ra St. Brown next year? So I figured I'd take this question next because the prospect model talk is top of mind. Amon-Ra St. Brown was a better prospect in my model than Gabriel Davis. He entered the league with about a 72nd percentile prospect score. And as I alluded to just now with Gabriel Davis, Amon-Ra St. Brown saw one of the biggest jumps from the prospect model to the year 2 model since 2011. St. Brown now has a year 2 percentile rank in the 91st percentile, almost the 92nd percentile. Year 2 players historically with that percentile score have done pretty well. But admittedly, there's not a massive difference between a score like that and a score in the low 80s. But if you look at players who ranked in the 85th to 95th percentiles in the year 2 model, you can paint a picture for St. Brown. Since 2011 and through 2019, we've got 38 wide receivers in that cluster. Of those 38, 5 of them gave you one season in either year 2 or year 3 with a PPR points per game average of 18 or more. So 13% of those players gave you a very solid mid-range wide receiver 1 season during their second or third year in the league, if not a higher end wide receiver 1. That number doubles when looking at 16 or more PPR points. And it's 37% when looking at 14 or more PPR points per game. And for the record, any player in this model that scores better than the 95th percentile is in really, really, really good shape. I'm talking Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, and my guy Elijah Moore. I think St. Brown is in a pretty good spot. I do have my concerns about what his true ceiling really is, which is sort of a concern that I had when he was coming out. He was always a solid enough prospect, though. I think the worry with him is what happens if the Lions have everyone healthy and add more competitive players to that offense. Targets are earned, yes, but if there's a ton of good competition, target shares can drop. Now, it's tough to answer where St. Brown should go next season because I haven't done season-long rankings yet for 2022. But in Dynasty, where I have done rankings, I've got St. Brown in a tier above Gabriel Davis at wide receiver 30. When looking at his year 1 to year 2 model comps, there are definitely guys who did not pan out. Don't get me wrong. But T.Y. Hilton and Stephon Diggs went through a very similar journey in my models. I'm not saying they're stylistically like St. Brown. Just that their stat scores are pretty similar from year 1 to year 2 and the jumps that they made. So I can definitely see the allure. But I'm likely just going to be at market value with St. Brown. It's not a strong take, but it's the truth. This next question is from @JustinWhiteVA. Of the upcoming free agent running backs, Ronald Jones, Rashad Penny, Chase Edmonds, coming off of their rookie contracts, which ones was your model high on coming out of college? I'm getting too old to trust my memory. Maybe giving hope for what could be in new scenery. So we're really talking about the 2018 draft class here, since those players have their rookie contracts coming up unless they got a new deal. But in that class, we had a lot of good running backs. Saquon Barkley is the standard in my model because he was an absolute freak coming out, and then he was selected second overall. But he's not a free agent. You mentioned Rashad Penny, and that's someone that my model loved. Penny was a very good prospect, according to the model. Clearly, it didn't hit for him until the final games of this past season, but he's incredibly intriguing. To give you some perspective, Penny had almost a 98th percentile rating in my model coming out. Since 2011 and through 2019, we've had 14 running backs hit at least a 95th percentile mark. Of those 14, 6 of them gave us a season with 20 or more PPR points during their first 3 years in the league. That's essentially a top 5 season. 8 of them gave us a season with 16 or more points. He just happened to be a bust among a lot of non-busts. But most running backs who are trying to get new contracts, I want guys who can catch passes, because they're the most likely to see work for a longer period of time, or more consistent work. So I'm not really that interested in Ronald Jones right now. I've never been interested in Ronald Jones. But Chase Edmonds, that's someone who I might watch. Just pay close attention to that side of a running back's game as he moves through his career. This next question is from @ABQJoe_R. Your recent show on misses got me thinking if you've ever done a meta-analysis, i.e., how did this year's mistakes compare to previous years? Do you find you still make the same mistake despite your intentions? Do you review past year's mistakes? I do make the same mistakes, but they're often results-based. Like with Damian Harris. I'm fine with missing on a player like Damian Harris, who had so many things go his way this year, but still finishes an RB2. I will almost never buy into a running back who has a very little pass-catching ceiling, Derrick Henry aside, because even in their best-case scenario, they're still not league-winning players. So I've missed on players like that in the past. And some of you might be saying, well, JJ, maybe it's a blind spot in your process. But I don't think it is. Because while I'm going to miss on those players, I also nail all of the players that people are buying into that only have 2 down upside. I avoided Ronald Jones for years and it largely paid off. That's just an example of that. So I would say that I make repeatable mistakes, yes. But I would also say that maybe like 90% of those mistakes, if I were to put a figure on it, are more results-based than anything else. And I'm cool with that. The things that I get wrong that I actually get angry about are the ones that are clearly foreseeable and I was just stupid in the moment. All right, we only have one more question this week. I dug deep on the questions that I did get because I thought it was more interesting that way. But this last question is from @Casey_Riggin. Can you explain why so many preseason/draft rankings have the player that finished 1 for their draft position ranked as 1 for their position the following year? Outside of tight end, repeat number 1 finishes happen so rarely, so isn't it more likely that someone else in that top 10 finishes number 1 overall? So first off, we obviously can't just assume that all rankings take the top player from one year and make him the top player the next. It definitely happens, but it's not all the time. But you're right, it's unlikely that a player repeats as the top performer at his position year over year. But that happens because it's really hard for a player to finish at the top of his position. Like, let's say that someone has Jonathan Taylor as their RB1 next year. He was the RB1 in 2021. Are you not going to rank him as the RB1 solely because of that reason? Okay, let's say that you don't rank him as the RB1. Then who do you put in his spot? Christian McCaffrey? Okay, that's valid. CMC obviously has that ceiling. But now you're drafting CMC over Taylor just because you think CMC has better odds to finish first overall. But does he actually have better odds to finish first overall? It's just really hard to finish first overall to begin with. Part of the reason that there's change with the top spot at each position is because in order for a player to be that good in fantasy football one year, he likely had to have at least somewhat of an outlier season. But if you have a player who has more repeatable peripherals, then it still makes sense to have him at the top of your rankings list. This isn't a game of who's going to finish first overall. It's a game of probability. So let's look at it through a probability-driven lens. And this is just an example. This is not how I actually feel about these players. But I think it drives home the point. Let's say there's a 0% chance that Jonathan Taylor finishes next season as the RB1 overall. But let's also say that there's a 100% chance that he finishes as the RB3. Now let's say that Christian McCaffrey has a 50% chance to finish as the RB1. But he also has a 50% chance to finish as the RB20. Christian McCaffrey has better odds of being the RB1 in fantasy football. Based on your question, you then think that he'd be more deserving of being ranked as the RB1 in fantasy football. But clearly he wouldn't be the better pick because you know that Taylor is giving you an RB3 performance. From an expected outcome standpoint, McCaffrey is not better. And from an expected outcome standpoint, chances are, when you looked across the running back landscape, Jonathan Taylor would still be your RB1, even though his odds of finishing as the RB1, those odds are 0 in this scenario. This is all about probability. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend.